We do appreciate your taking time out of your day to join us today, so we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like we've got a good group of people here. Good afternoon, welcome, and thank you again for joining us. My name is Troy Forscher. I'm a Senior Upgrade Technician here at Galen Healthcare Solutions. We're going to spend some time today talking about the Allscripts Enterprise Web Server role. The format that we like to use is that you can feel free to post questions within the webinar software as they come up, so you don't forget about them. We may not be able to answer those until later in the presentation. We usually save them for the end, and hopefully we can provide everyone with some new information today that they can use. Before we get too far into the information that we have to share with you today, I just wanted to do a quick poll to get a sense of the audience that we have today. So just give me a second to get that set up for you here. And we're just interested in getting a sense of the audience that we have today. We like to get a sense of the audience so that we can, target the way that we talk about these things based on the type of people that we're dealing with. Looks like we've got everyone into the poll, I think, that we're going to get. So it looks like about 50% of the audience is within an IT or IS role. About 40% are in either an EHR or like a business analyst role. So that's always good to understand. So the agenda for today. We're going to start off talking about the virtual directories. So virtual directories are a function within IIS, or Internet Information Services. It's the core of the web server for a Windows server. We'll move on to talk about the VOE, or the Virtual Object Engine. That is the core for server connectivity from the web server to the database server within this Allscripts Enterprise environment. We'll follow that with the VOE control panel, which is where we configure the VOE connections. We'll move from there into the web framework configuration. The key of that is going to be the configuration file, and we'll walk through quickly how that file is set up for connectivity to the IDX web framework database. We'll move from there into talking about the web server specifications, the core software and hardware requirements for this server role. Move from there into the web services, what do we need installed on this server role to prepare for the installation of the enterprise software. We'll talk through data access paths, just get a sense of how this server fits in with all the other different server roles within an enterprise environment. And then the last thing that we'll cover is some of the system maintenance pieces involved in this role. We'll talk through some things like performance monitoring, event logs, etc. So before we get too far into virtual directories, what is IIS? IIS is a group of internet servers for Windows Server. The server that we take advantage of course, is the web server. And, so a virtual directory within IIS is a folder within a given website. And the virtual part of that is, of course, that the URL points to a physical server on the local machine. The first of the virtual directories we talk about is the AHS Web. And that is your IDX Web Framework directory, and of course that is customized for Allscripts Enterprise product. The next virtual directory we have is your TouchWorks virtual directory. That's the core of the HR web services. Next we have a TRX web, which must run as a service account. That's your dictate and PDA functions. We run that as a service account, and it, because it needs to have permission to your dictation file shares. Similar with the scan web, that's your scan image access. We run that as a service account as well, so that has permission to the scan warehouses. CMS v4 is the VOE database connection, another one of the virtual directories that must run as a service account. And then we have the AHS report handler. That is the directory that handles the reports that you run within EHR. And just a note about that service account that I talked about, it's highly recommended that the service account be a separate account from your domain support account. The concern there is that if someone is trying to log in with your support account and locks that out from a number of bad password guesses, we don't want that to negatively affect the services that are running under that separate service account. Here's a quick screen capture of what those directories look like within IIS, and we'll go ahead and jump on one of the test servers here to walk through a couple of the key features within these the setup of these things. We'll come to this later. So the first thing I'll share with you is we'll go ahead and find one of those that we'd like to have set up with a domain service account, and we'll show you where that is. So the directory security is here within the properties of that virtual directory, and you can see authentication and access control here. We edit that. Here's your service account. In this case, it's a local machine service account. Generally, we find that people are using domain-based service accounts. And the domain part of that is usually just so that you can have a single account that matches across all your servers that you can manage at a higher level. It's important that these all get set to use .NET 2.0. So that's under your ASP.NET tab here. You can see that version is 2.0. It's also important that these virtual directories are aligned with each their own application pool. We see that setting at the bottom of your virtual directory tab within the CMS v4 properties, application pool, CMS v4. And I'll jump into that application pool and just go through some of the key settings there. The first tab we get when we open up that CMS v4 pool properties is the recycling tab. It's highly recommended that this worker process, be cycled on a daily basis. We really want to run that off hours if you can, so the recommendation here is it's basically 12:30 midnight, early in the morning. Under the performance tab, we have this request queue limit setting. It's recommended that be set at 1,000. And then the last thing that's important within these pool properties is the identity, and we want those identities set as a local system. The next thing that we'll talk about is the Allscripts Enterprise EHR Virtual Object Engine. The Virtual Object Engine is the key communication mechanism between the web and the database servers. The VOE runs as a service and is commonly set up running 3 application groups, and we'll get into those in just a second. The VOE leverages system-level DSNs set up using ODBC. Here's the ODBC Data Source Administrator you see here, and here's the Object Engine. This is a control panel that you use to configure those. We'll go ahead and walk through some setup on those. We'll start with ODBC. And the main thing to understand about the way that this is set up is that the ODBC controls the server that you'll be connecting to. And the VOE handles the authentication within that. When we get into the VOE settings, you'll see a user ID and password, and then it leverages this DSN. So if we get into configuration for this, right on that first screen, we're pointing it at the server here. We put in our credentials to make sure that they work successfully, and we'll test this connection at the end here once we're done setting it up. We test that, test completed successfully. And that's pretty much the setup for these. The BOE is done within a control panel. Go ahead and open that here. And you have your AHS, which ties into the connection string here. You have your user ID and password, which leverages that IDXWF DSN that we set up. Those three application groups are the core of this system. The AHS Web is your IDX Web Framework connection. TouchWorks connects to your Works database, and the TWIS actually connects to the Impact database. You can see here I've got some screenshots of the process we just walked through. It might be a little easier to see those on your screen. I know the server sometimes is a little bit small and tough to read. Again, we're setting up the name of the application group and the number of threads for that pool. There's a metadata file that we configure against, and then the last piece there, which is kind of the key ingredient, is that connection string where we're feeding in the user ID and password pair for the SQL user that's going to connect to the database, and then the DSN leverages that machine name that we put into the ODBC to connect. So the VOE control panel app groups, just to review, AHS Web is your IDX Web Framework database, which leverages an IDXWF ODBC. TouchWorks is your Works database and is generally called Works for ODBC. And then TWIS, which is your document imaging, connects to your Impact database and is generally uses the TWIS ODBC. In terms of the web framework configuration, the database server connection information is stored in init.xml. There's 3 keys within that file. The database key, which confirms the server name. We want to make sure that that's accurate. And then you have your user and password. The password in this file is encrypted during installation. And we'll look at that file here briefly. Here you can see the name of the server, the database server that we're connecting to, the name of the user here, and then the password, as I said, is encrypted within this XML file. Before we get into the server specifications, I'm just going to have another quick poll for you guys. Just give me a second to get that up for you. And so, you know, we do other webinars just like this one, and we have obviously other server roles within this environment that we can cover. Just interested in getting a sense of what server roles you're interested in learning more about in the future. You have the database server role, the message server role, and the scan server role. And this is a multi-answer question, so if you're interested in more than one of the servers, you go ahead and check off whichever ones you're interested in. Looks like we've got everyone in for that. Looks like almost everybody is interested in learning more about the database server role. A lot of people interested in message servers, and even a little over 40% of you are interested in learning more about that scan server role. So server specifications, there's two groupings here. We've got the pre-11.2 and then the 11.2. Pre-11.2, we're supporting Windows 2003 with Service Pack 2 for an operating system. IIS 6 is required, and then the Internet Explorer, it's either 6, Service Pack 2, or 3, as well as Internet Explorer 7. That's supported on the pre-11.2 specification. When we go to 11.2, it's Windows 2003 Server, Service Pack 2, x86 only, or Windows 2008 Server, x86 or x64, excuse me. And then on there, it's Internet Explorer 6, Service Pack 3 specifically, or 7 or 8. Server specifications on the hardware side, we're looking for a minimum of 2 times 1.4 gigahertz processor cores, 1 gig of RAM at least, and then the 2 36 gig disk drives. Those are 10,000 RPM or higher, configured as one logical RAID 1 device. Larger drive sizes may be substituted here. The requirement has more to do with the speed and configuration of the drives than the size. And it's important that we don't forget that the drives do fill up from time to time with log files and installation media. It's best to set some sort of monitoring on your local C drive, so someone within your staff is alerted when it reaches, for example, 75% capacity, whatever that threshold is that you feel like you need to be notified so that you have time to react, whether it's cleaning the disk or getting some more space allocated on that machine. The last thing we'll talk about for specifications is that GE framework version 5.02 is what you're going to need when using Internet Explorer 8. Web services, the core of any web application is that World Wide Web service. That's the application service for IIS servers. AHS-VOE service, that's your EHR data access service. We talked about that earlier. Medicine is the retrieval for the Medicine templates. It's important to note that a new service, and you'll see it labeled within services as Medicine Serve, is used for all versions of VHR from v11.1.7 Service Pack 1 and higher. So it's important to note when you guys are going out to download those Medicine updates from Allscripts, there is labeling on the folders that you download as such that, Service Pack 1 of 11.1.7 or higher, you're going to want that newer Medicine engine. The last thing there is the Microsoft .NET 2.0. So ASP.NET was new for version 11 functionality, and it's pretty easy to see where those changes have been made to the application. .NET workspaces can be identified because they have an integrated toolbar. So if you're in a workspace and you have the floating toolbar, that's still primarily leveraging the IDX web framework, whereas when you see those integrated toolbars, you're in a .NET workspace. Just a brief discussion here on the data access paths. The database is leveraging that VOE connection as well as the web framework connectivity. Document imaging and transcription are both using a Windows file share for access. And again, that image warehouse needs to be accessible by that domain service account. Printing, we talk about print preview. Print preview is handled locally on the web servers, and that's important to note when you're using customized report files. Those print preview drives, you need to have the custom report installed on each of the web servers because the print preview is done locally within that machine. The hard copies when you're printing are sent through they're basically submitted to a queue in the database, and then the spooler that's on those message servers reaches into that queue to grab the next job in line. Just a brief agenda as we get into the system maintenance portion of this. We're going to talk about event logs and their importance, performance baselines and setting up and scheduling, performance monitoring. It's important to plan for future growth. We'll talk a little bit about where that comes into play and how to manage that. Bandwidth capacity in terms of bandwidth from any remote sites getting to the data center. We'll talk a little bit about change control and test versus live systems. Always apply and test first. So the event logs, it's important that there's a regular review of these logs. I'll show you an example of a common non-issue, which is terminal server devices you see on here, and I'll pull that up for you here just a second. If we go into the event viewer under application, you can see this is pretty clean. If we go into system, you can see errors like this term server devices. So in this instance, this is actually not an issue with the server, but an issue with the way that I have my client machine set up. The client machine is configured to share its devices with the server. When the server goes to map those devices over, there's a failure there. So although this is an error and shows up in the log, it's really not anything of concern. This is often a great place to use some type of monitoring software if you aren't already, to look for warnings or errors within these logs. It's pretty easy to set something up that to either notify you or to run daily or weekly reports to look for these types of issues. Performance baselines. It's always great if we can create a snapshot of normal metric levels on a machine. What we'll do is go ahead and look at what it looks like to create a counter log. We have the ability to load predefined groups of metrics within a counter log and set that up with a schedule. So when you first come into performance, you're just going to have this screen here, and I'll make it a little bigger for you there. And it's pretty straightforward. We can go in and add measurements. One of the ones we see a lot of people using when they have performance concerns, we'll go into this web service, and we'll go ahead and go into current connections total. We'll add that in. As you can see, I've asked everybody to stay off this test server for me while I'm giving you guys a demonstration. But normally this would be, depending on time of day, 50, 100, 150. We're looking to have that number to stay under 200, and if it's consistently going over 200, then you need more web servers. It's pretty easy to set up a counter log. There's three key ingredients. So in this case, I'll show you what we do. We can do a new log settings from there, and that'll actually allow us to take a pre-existing list of defined metrics that we want to gather. This is a SQL one that we'll use here, but it just gives you a sense that you'll see this will load up with a list of metrics predefined. So the first piece of this, we'll call it new scheduled, is this general tab. And this is a series of counters. Like I said, those are predefined in a file, but you could sit here and add or remove the objects that you want. You set your interval, and then there's actually an option for a run as. We move into the log file settings. So the name of the file is on that first tab there, and then this is how we end the name of the files, in terms of an increment. In this case, we'll start at number 1. You can add a comment or set it up to overwrite existing log files if you want. The last piece of that is setting up a schedule. So you can just save this off and set it to run manually later, or you can set it to run at a specific time. And then of course you want to set it to stop, either when you tell it to stop or after a certain amount of time, or at a specific time on a specific day. The thing that we see that most people are doing with these is to get a couple of different baselines. So you may want to run one, on the weekend when nobody's around, to get a sense of the load, if any, on the server when there's nobody on. And then it's important to get an understanding of when your end users are kind of at their peak usage levels. You may have to do some initial monitoring to get a sense of that, and then you can use that as a key. We have a lot of clients that would say, the majority of their busiest time is, Monday morning at 10 a.m. until about 1 o'clock Monday afternoon. When we talk about planning for future growth, the key piece there is one web server for every 200 connections. The concern there is actually that VOE engine. The VOE engine doesn't handle more than about 200 connections without causing some degradation of performance and end user experience. So it's important that we try and keep away from getting more than that number of connections on a server. And if you are gonna grow out servers, if you only have one right now, but you're gonna add a couple more, it's important to validate the load balancer configuration before moving to live. There's some key settings within there that have to do with session persistence that can cause some headaches for your end users if they're not set up properly. A great example is the clients that are still using the V10 Note product. There's a Note session ID that's stored per each user on the local web server machine, and if you move servers in the midst of creating a note, you'll actually get an error when you go to save it, and you won't be able to save it. Cloning of VMs has been mostly successful in our experience. We've often had to revisit the service account passwords in the virtual directories that we looked at earlier, where that's used. But oftentimes VM cloning can be as simple as renaming and re-IPing the clone, and then anytime you're using clones to point to a new environment, it's often as simple as some of the steps we went into earlier in terms of changing the server name that's in those ODBCs that are leveraged by the VOE, and then updating the server name that's in that init.xml file. We'll talk about bandwidth capacity. When we talk about this, we're generally talking about from end users to the web servers. One of the key pieces that we talk to clients about is batch scanning. That can be a major contender for available bandwidth. We've had some clients actually set up an additional process within that scan functionality that sets up what's called a host data receive process. Sets up a queue on either an individual local workstation or a group of workstations to store those image files locally until the process kicks off, at night usually, to pull those across the network and into the image warehouse. It's important to keep in mind that most sites are using their connection to get to more than just the EHR. For smaller remote sites that have just a T1 to get to the internet and your data center, that EHR product isn't the only thing they're using that connection for. The recommendations that we'll talk about here briefly is a requirement per site, and this is, most of our clients are using either scan and or dictate. This is the requirement for that. So a base connection of 1024 and then plus per user of 40. So the requirement for each of those scan stations is another 512. So those, as you can tell, would add up pretty quickly. If you have 4 or 5 scan stations, you're looking at multiple T1s or a fiber connection to the data center. Not a whole lot on this slide, but change control. Change control is important. We want to keep things stable. Most clients have this well under control, but there's almost always room for improvement. test versus live system. We want to apply changes in test first. And once we've applied the changes, we want to get real users to validate functionality after the change, but before proceeding in live. What that means for most people is that even if it's just a hotfix that they're putting in, you're probably going to want at least a couple of weeks for your team to validate the changes and their effect on your workflow before putting that into live. And this is that's always been the approach for both hotfixes and service pack updates, as well as obviously the much larger full version updates. Back to the agenda from before, just a quick review. We talked through the enterprise virtual directories, and the way that those are leveraged in the IaaS that's set up on the Microsoft servers, the Windows servers. We talked about the enterprise EHR virtual object engine and the control panel that's used to configure that, as well as the ODBC connections that are tied into that. We talked about the web framework. That's the core of the IDX connectivity. We talked about both core software and hardware specifications, requirements for this server role, what web services we need installed, what do we need as a core of this role before we can install enterprise software. We reviewed the data access paths from this web server to the database server, how it relates to dictation file shares and image file shares. And then, we went through the system maintenance, perfmons and event logs, etc. Got one more poll for you guys, and then we'll take a look and see what we have for questions out there. Let me just get that going for you. Poll. And this poll is just about, in addition to our free webcasts, we'd like, would you be interested in more information on the full range of tools and services offered by Galen? And some of you that are interested may be going to ACE. We'll be at ACE. That's next week, and we're booth 601. Go ahead and visit us if you can. We're going to be giving away a Gibson guitar while we're there. Just looking to see what we have for questions out there. Just give us a second here. It doesn't look like we have any questions out there. Just give everybody another minute if they're in the middle of typing a question and posting it. Looks like we have a question about setting up Citrix virtual environments. The setup that clients do for Citrix is something that we definitely have documentation for that we've received from Allscripts in terms of their recommendations for setting that up. It's not something that we often deal with, but we do have some expertise on the team here at Galen in regards to that. Any sort of specific questions you might have, we would more than likely be able to, either give you an answer pretty quickly or find out who would know that for you. The majority of the issues that we've seen with Citrix, have to do with proper setup of the web controls files that are involved, as well as the trust relationship that needs to be established between each user session and the server. Another question about Citrix and dictation. We're trying to use dictation over Citrix. Is that possible? Yes. The key to using Citrix over dictation has to do with giving each of the users the rights to the necessary directory where those users will store the files within Citrix temporarily on their way up to the server. The other key ingredient with that is making sure that you work with your users to understand that those files need to be uploaded to the server before they close out their session. That's of course because there's no guarantee that the next time they sign into Citrix that they'll be on the same server, which means they won't have those files accessible to them to upload at a later time. As far as I can see, that's all the questions we have from you guys today. I want to thank everybody again for their time. We understand that you guys are busy, and as I said before, we hope that everybody was able to learn something new today.